What's up, my wizards? It's Dev. From Mtg, we like magic, and we just had a modern Pro Tour, believe it or not. That actually happened again, and it was awesome. It was a lot of fun to watch, and I think it helped prove that modern is a really diverse format. A lot of different decks over the weekend, but in the wake of that, we turn our eyes again towards standard, and that's where I come in. What we're going to do in this video is just really dig deep into Rivals of Ixalan Standard. We've got 3 weeks of tournament results to comb through, and it might not seem like too much, especially since the Pro Tour was modern and not standard, but that's just one less event to look at. We've actually got way more tournaments so far this season than you might think. We've got 2 different Magic Online Pro Tour qualifiers, the MOX, the Magic Online Championship Series, the NRG event, the championship event. We've got 2 different events in Philly, an SCG Team Constructed Open, and a Classic, and there's even more tournaments than that. There's been a couple of tournaments across the Pacific at Haruruya Games, so there's been a lot of data to comb through to bring you this video, but I think we're finally ready for it. So, since we're going to be talking about a lot in this video, I should probably go ahead and jump into it. Now, what we're going to do here is, as I move through the decks, I'll give you all the key cards that they always play no matter what, and I'll give you some basic pointers about how they've drawn up their strategy to win the game. But if you want deck lists, don't worry. I've got you covered in the description just below me. Hit show more, and there will be a wealth of information for you. Any single deck at all that I talk about in this video, there will be a link to a deck list in the description box. So just remember that when you get done with the video, or right now if you're really interested in it, check out the description. There's a ton of decks down there. But for now, I'm going to start from the top, because if I started from the bottom, like the worst best deck, I guess, then I'd just be referencing the best decks all day. It just seems a little backwards. So I'll start with what I think is the #1 deck, not just now, but moving forward, because I think it's got the best ability to adapt to the format, and that's Grixis. Well, this deck got 1st and 2nd place at the NRG Championship and 1st in the Magic Online Championship, not to mention many other top 8 and top 16 appearances for Grixis. And there are a few different ways to build this deck right now, but what people are leaning more towards as time goes on is the Grixis energy list that plays like a straight-up mid-range deck. Sometimes you'll see control decks that play very few creatures and mostly spells, but more increasingly today, it seems like people are sticking with the energy list that's essentially much more of a mid-range list than a control list. Let me show you all the key cards from that. Now, the cool thing about Grixis is that it gets access to some of the best threats in the entire format. We're essentially sort of a Teamer Energy deck that has dropped the green to add black, and that makes us a little bit more controlling and a little bit more of a mean mid-range deck, rather than like a curve-out mid-range deck with a bunch of value creatures. We get to play way more removal in this list, but we also get awesome early-game threats like Glintsleeve Siphoner. Siphoner's decent against aggro sometimes. It's at least main deckable, because it's going to trade with a creature a lot of the time. At least in the early game, that'll help you get to the mid game, where you can outclass them with all of your ridiculous threats. And against control decks, this is ridiculous too. It's almost always going to get through in the early game. It's going to force an answer, draw you a card or 2 at least a lot of the time, especially if you're on the play. And that's backbreaking against control, and it's a source of early damage. This list will also play Whirler Virtuoso. It's porting it over from the Teamer list. And even though we don't have as many ways to generate excess energy, like Attune with Ether or Rogue Refiner, those cards are obviously banned now. That doesn't mean that Whirler Virtuoso is any less dangerous. This is still a very potent card and one of the best 3-drops in the entire format. But those are just our early game drops. We've actually, in these colors, got access to the best 4, 5, and 6 drops in the whole format, if you want to ask me. And part of the reason we're playing those early game drops is to force our opponent to remove them, and then by the time we get to these big guys, they don't have as many options to remove them. And, again, our early game dudes are value creatures, so even if they do force removal out of the opponent's hand, we've still gotten some value out of them, and now they have to deal with these ridiculous big guys. So let's look at these ridiculous big guys. These decks play the Scarab God, a card we'll see an awful lot today. They play Glorybringer, and they usually play at least 1, if not 2 copies of Torrential Gearhulk, even if they're on the mid-range plan. Now, Beetlejuice is good with pretty much all of the creatures in this deck. Obviously, a 4/4 Siphoner or Virtuoso is an awesome pick out of the graveyard, but if you can pluck Glorybringer or Hulk out of your graveyard, you're having a great time, and whoever's on the other side of the table is having a miserable time. So, the Scarab God's good by itself, but it also combines very well with all of the creatures that we typically see in this deck. Now, as far as Glorybringer and the Hulk, Glorybringer is just a big, dumb, game-ending flyer. It's evasive. It can kill stuff on the other side of the board. It has haste. It's good against aggro, other mid-range decks, and even control. when resolved. So it's just one of the better creatures in the whole format. The deck plays at least 2 copies, if not 3, or even sometimes the full playset. And Torrential Gearhulk, another great way to just blow your opponent out and win the game. You know, it's great, especially after boards, to get a counter spell with your Torrential Gearhulk, counter whatever they're playing, usually a creature, and then end up with a 5/6. Just a ridiculous blowout. Maybe you draw some cards out of your graveyard with your Hulk at the end of their turn. It's crazy to play during their combat step. Just, you know, Torrential Gearhulk has not lost a step in the entire time that he's been in Standard. It's still a ridiculous card. And even though it's not a creature, another huge threat for the deck is Chandra, Torch of Defiance. This is another card that we'll cover a good bit today. Chandra is one of the top 3 cards in the format, definitely, by just about any metric. She sees a lot of play in a lot of different decks, and there's obviously reasons why. She's just one of the best Planeswalkers we've seen in Standard in a good little while, I'd say. She does 4 different things, you know. Obviously, she can kill creatures too. The deck is just overloaded with removal. Even if the mid-range version doesn't end up playing a ton of spells, even its creatures and Planeswalkers are good at removing creatures. So you got Chandra for that too. It's card draw, which is probably one of the better things that it does. And if you can resolve it against control, you get to out card draw them and eventually ultimate them for the win. So just everything about Chandra is good. She's pretty much not bad in any matchup. Not only do these colors get access to some of the best threats in Standard, they also get access to easily the best removal in Standard. We get Harness Lightning, Fatal Push, and Vraska's Contempt. Obviously, Harness Lightning goes with our energy theme, so it can give us extra energy for, you know, Whirler Virtuoso or Glintsleeve Siphoner if we needed to. We can draw extra cards. Or make extra Thopters for our 2 mana at instant speed. That's kind of cool. Or we could obviously just use it to shoot down like 4 and 5 toughness creatures sometimes. It's great to play out of the graveyard with the Torrential Gearhulk when you got extra energy laying around. Just a lot of cool stuff about Harness Lightning. It's still a fantastic piece of removal. If you're playing energy, there's no reason to play anything else. Unless you want to throw in like 2 copies of a Braid or something, but you'll always see at least the playset of Harness Lightning. Push, I don't have to say a whole lot about. There's a lot of aggro in this format right now, and we'll get to that in just a second, so it's great against all those decks. But Vraska's Contempt is fast shaping up to be the most important piece of removal in this format. You know, we've got the Scarab God, Rekindling Phoenix, Hazoret, Ronus. There are a ton of creatures that are either indestructible or will continue to come back forever. Scrapheap Scrounger is something that's becoming more important by the day. Again, in this format. Everything old's new again in this format. So there's a ton of threats that you have to exile. Not to mention eternalized creatures and bomb creatures, Earthshaker Kenra and the like, Champion of Wits. So there are great many reasons to play Vraska's Contempt right now. Now, Grixis I like because it's one of the least solved lists in the format. The correct build, the quote-unquote correct build, has in no way been established yet. So sometimes you'll see all kinds of stuff I haven't even talked about. You'll see up to 4 whole copies of Rekindling Phoenix occasionally. You'll see a couple copies of Ravenous Chupacabra every now and again because it plays really well with the Scarab God. They're becoming fast friends in this meta, and you'll even sometimes see a couple of copies of Gonti, Lord of Luxury, to combat other mid-range and control decks. This resolves against control. They're having a bad time. Now, there's so much variance in Grixis lists right now that I mentioned this a minute ago. There's actually a whole other Grixis list I could cover, Grixis Control, that is becoming a little less popular as the format moves on. People are trending towards Grixis Energy. At least that's what I see. But the Grixis Control list looks pretty good. It basically deadens all the removal in your opponent's hand. It cuts pretty much every creature from the deck except for Beetles and Torrential Gearhulk, and just plays spells, you know, and it gets access to a lot of good stuff too. You know, it gets Glimmer of Genius, it gets Essence Scatter, which is actually kind of one of the better pieces of removal in the entire format, and it's got Supreme Will, plus a bunch of other options it can play. But those are the 3 biggest ones, I think. As a matter of fact, I think Essence Scatter is, bar none, one of the best cards in the format right now, because it deals with a lot of stuff. You know, Rekindling Phoenix won't come back, Scarab God won't come back, it doesn't care about the Indestructible on Hazoret or Ronus. There's just a lot of stuff that Essence Scatter can do for you in this format right now, and you'll never have to worry about some of the best creatures in the meta. There's a lot of different Grixis lists out there, and they all look really strong, and they're all finishing very strong as well. So right now, not only do I think this is the best deck in the format at the moment, but again, I just think that it's the most chameleon list that we have right now, so it's got the best chance of adapting to pretty much anything that it meets. So I like this list moving forward too. Now right now, Grixis holds about 15%. Well, Now, right now, Grixis Energy holds about 15% of the meta, and the Grixis control decks make up another few percent. So, Grixis isn't quite at 20% of the meta yet, but that's still a huge meta share. But that being said, it was kind of tough deciding which deck I wanted to be number 1 and number 2. Now, I've already told you, I think Grixis has the better chance of adapting as we go forward here, so I gave it number 1, but there's really not much of a difference at the moment in the meta share between Grixis and Mono Red Aggro, which I gave number 2 to. Now, in contrast to Grixis, the thing with the mono red lists is that they're fairly rigid. There's really not a whole lot of variance here outside of 1 or 2 cards in main decks. You know, you're still opening up the game with Bomac Courier and Soulscar Mage. Your 1-drops haven't changed. Sometimes, sparingly, you'll see a copy or 2 of Fanatical Firebrand, but it is not very often. Usually those decks would play Rigging Runner in older formats, in the last standard, for instance, but instead of Rigging Runner, we're seeing a lot more Fanatical Firebrand, but it's not in every single list, and it's never a 4 of, so just keep that in mind. But as far as 2-drops go, they're pretty much the same as they've ever been too. Earthshaker Kenra and Kari Zev form the core of our 2-drops. Now, all these 1 and 2 drops still make us one of the most reliable decks when it comes to getting on board early in the game, and they allow for some really fast starts. But our mid and late game drops haven't changed either. We're going to play On-Crop Crasher and Hazoret, of course. Hazoret, the most important card for this deck, and usually the way things are going to finish, that too has not changed, and I don't see it changing until the card rotates. Now, the removal is pretty much the same in this deck as well. You know, 4 Lightning Strike, 4 Shock, and then either 2 or 3 copies of a Braid. You'll see that occasionally. Now, one thing that did kind of change about this deck, and people were doing this in the last format, but they're doing it with a lot more frequency now. The deck always, no matter what, main decks at least a couple of copies of Chandra Torch of Defiance. This was a sideboard card for a lot of the deck's existence, but later on in the last format, they started main decking it more often. The same is true here. It's just, again, like I said earlier, it's good in nearly every single matchup. If you don't have Hazoret as your 4-drop, this is a fine 4-drop, but it's good when you top deck it late in the game. It's good the turn after Hazoret. You know, there's just a million different ways and situations to play Chandra, and you don't have to work too hard to make her good. Now, honestly, I wish that this list had innovated a little bit more over the last couple of months, but the fact of the matter is it just doesn't have to. You stick with what works, and this deck is still working very, very well, even with the loss of Ramunap Ruins. You know, it didn't really care too much about losing Ferocidon out of the sideboard, and sometimes it'd play a copy or 2 of Ferocidon. It's made up for that now by playing Pia Nalar instead, which is still a ridiculously good 3-drop, so it shrugged off the loss of Ferocidon. But even though it doesn't have the late game power that it once had, the ability to close out the game with Ramunap Ruins or Ramunap Ruins or 2, it's still trucking. It's still maybe the best deck in the format. It's still at least the number 2 deck in the format. And honestly, after number 1 and 2, I think that the power level of the decks drops off somewhat significantly. So Mono Red is still one of the best decks in the format by an awful lot at the end of the day. Now, I say there's very little variance in the mono red list, and that may be true, but there's actually a red-black aggro list that's essentially mono red that cuts a couple of cards so it can have access to Unlicensed Disintegration, not only for amazing removal, but more late-game reach, because we don't have Ruins anymore. But it also gets to play, I think more importantly, Scrap Heap Scrounger, which is a crazy card against all the control decks right now. Another cool thing about the red blacklist is that it has access to control hate in the sideboard, like Duress, for instance. And yeah, the red sideboard will include like Direfleet, Daredevil, and a couple of other options, but if you're looking to really host control in your local meta, then red-black is probably the better option, just because you've got Scrap Heap to really annoy control decks, and you've got options out of your sideboard to get, you know, removal or counter spells out of their hand. But you are stretching the mana. Usually the more consistent deck wins, and mono red has proven that so far this season at least. Now, I figured I'd pop back in real quick just to reiterate, I know I just said this, but I think there's a fair degree of separation between 1 and 2 and the rest of the field. And so far, the meta tends to show that. The data does. MTG Goldfish's meta page, the standard meta page, now says that Grixis and mono red decks are about, give or take a little bit, statisticians, about 15 to 16% of the format each. They each, well, when put together, occupy about 32% of the format, and their different variants when you add them together, like Red-Black or Grixis Control, for instance, they occupy about 40% of the meta, which is a huge meta share. The rest of the decks we'll talk about today occupy well under 10% of the meta apiece. So again, I think there's a large degree of separation between the first two decks and the rest of the field, but it doesn't mean the other decks aren't bad. I actually think we're in a fairly diverse meta right now. Now, with all that said, my number 3 deck occupies about 8%, approximately 8% of the meta. That's almost half of the first two decks. You know, they occupy about 15.5 to 16% of the format apiece. So that's a large drop in relevancy. But again, don't think that makes Constrictor a bad deck. The Snake is back. Both Sultai and Black-Green have been putting up results. Now, the basic core of this deck, regardless of whether or not it's Sultai or straight Black-Green, is the same as it ever was. You know, you've got the Snake itself, Winding Constrictor, Walking Ballista, and then Rishkar and Verdurous Hulk are both very important cards to the list. As a matter of fact, Verdurous Hulk is a much more important card to the list, at least seemingly, than it was last season. But those are really just the Black-Green lists that play Verdurous Hulk. In Sultai lists, you'll usually see some or very often all of the Verdurous Gear Hulks dropped in favor of a couple of copies of the Scarab God. Yet another deck that's succumbing to Beetlemania. You know, this is one of the best cards in the format right now, and it functions well with not only all the creatures I've already told you about. Even Snake, bringing back Snake as a 4/4 is an option you won't exercise very often because you'll usually have better options, but it is an option, so there's that. But this deck has access to even other, you know, amazing creatures that I haven't even talked about yet that are great with the Scarab God, like Glintsleeve Siphoner. There are shades in this deck of the Grixis deck because it gets to play some of the best black pieces in the format. You know, it gets Glintsleeve Siphoner, it gets Vraska's Contempt, it gets Fatal Push for its removal, some of the best removal we can possibly play right now. And just like the Grixis deck too, it also plays the Scarab God. So there are some shades of Grixis here, but it's still mostly a basic green-black Constrictor deck, with the exception that now in this format it gets to play Jade Light Ranger, which is a great way to curve from Constrictor on turn 3. You know, everybody's talked about this. It's possible to get a 6/5 Jade Light Ranger on turn 3, given that you played Constrictor on turn 2. But, you know, Jade Light's pretty good almost any point in the game, and it's great to bring back with the Scarab God another way to get a 6-powered Jade Light Ranger. That'll also maybe help you filter through some cards, you know, sort of pseudo-scribe for you. It'll fuel the graveyard. Explorer will fuel the graveyard for the Scarab God too, so there's that. There's a lot of cool things about Jade Light Ranger in this deck. If nothing else, it'll help you hit your curve. This is sort of a curve-out mid-range deck, whether or not you're playing the Black-Green or the Sultai version. And even if you're a little low on lands on turn 3, as long as you can get to Jade Light Ranger, it almost guarantees you another land. Not quite, but it really helps you pick up a 4th land if you don't have it yet. I like that about Jade Light too. There's a lot of cool stuff going on with this card. Now, personally, I've always liked Constrictor lists for the last year. I like their brand of mid-range because there's a lot of payoff to the setup. But that's where the concerns about the deck comes in. It's really two-pronged, and one of them is just that. You know, the deck, does it have to set up too much? Does it require Winding Constrictor on turn 2 too much? Then you have to cross your fingers and sort of just pray that Winding Constrictor doesn't get Harness Lightning or Abraded or whatever before your next turn and before you get your payoff. That's a very real concern. And another one is people are saying, and again, this isn't strictly me, this is just a growing concern in the community. People are wondering, is the Sultai Snake list just a bad version of the Grixis Energy list? Which I understand, you know, you're essentially cutting red, you're cutting cards like Harness Lightning and Glorybringer for cards like Jade Light Ranger and Verdurous Gear Hulk, which on their surface don't look like quite as good cards. But again, it's all about personal preference. I think that just like the Grixis list, the Sultai Snake deck has some really good early game options, some of the best removal in the format, and the best ways to grind out a game in the format, really. Like, one cool thing about Black-Green and Sultai lists with the Snake as opposed to Grixis is that they have the ability to be really explosive. There's a huge payoff to the setup. Whereas Grixis lists are a lot more versatile. They don't really rely on setup and payoff. They can just take care of things on almost any turn of the game. So the two decks do play differently, even though there's similarities between them. And I don't necessarily think that Sultai is just a bad version of Grixis Energy. I think it's a matter of personal preference here. The payoff is very, very real in Sultai Snake, but there's a lot more versatility in the Grixis list. But we're on to my number 4 deck here, and this actually surprised me a little bit. According to MTG Goldfish, at the time that I'm recording this video, this deck is just a sliver more than 5% of the format. It's not quite as popular across the Pacific and Haruruya in the Japanese tournaments. I haven't seen this deck turn up too much, but here in the West, we see this deck an awful lot more than I would have thought going into this format, and that's blue-black control. This is yet another Grixis list that just cuts red. You know, we just said that about Sultai Snake, but this is still a list that's going to hinge on the Beetle. Obviously, we're going to talk about that card a good bit. And Tori. Torrential Gearhulk is also here in this list, but that's pretty much the only creatures you're going to see in the main deck of blue-black control pretty much ever. You'll see either 2 to 3 Scarab God and then 2 to 3 Torrential Gearhulk. But of course, this deck overloads on spells. Blue and black have some of the best spells in the format, as they usually do. Obviously, black has great removal like Fatal Push and Vraska's Contempt. Already talked about those, but the deck usually plays at least a 2 of, if not more, Moment of Craving. This is brand new out of Rivals of Ixalan. The deck has replaced Essence Extraction with this card, which is fine. It kills most of the same stuff that Essence Extraction kills. Gains you 1 less life, but who cares? You play it a turn earlier. It's a much, much easier to play card that doesn't require quite the commitment to black, and all that is incredibly important. Moment of Craving is actually shaping up to be a really relevant card in this format. But of course, not only do we have access to the best removal in the format, we've also got access to a bunch of incredible counterspells. This is a base blue deck for the most part, so we're just going to go all the way and play double blue counterspells like Disallow at a full rev, and we don't care. But we're also going to play all 4 copies of Essence Scatter. Already talked about how crazy that card is in this video, and it hasn't changed in the last 5 minutes. Essence Scatter is maybe, when the dust settles, the best counterspell in the format. But this deck will also usually play 3 to 4 Censor, and it'll occasionally play other counterspells. It's worth noting, too, this deck almost always plays some number of Supreme Will, all the way up to 4, but usually 3. But overall, though, that's about it. This is a basic, run-of-the-mill, cut-and-dried, blue-black control list that we've been seeing for a while now. A lot of people had this deck pegged to be good in the last season, but it never quite panned out. But now, since the bannings, the format slowed down just a step for this deck. You know, one bad thing about control right now, if there is a bad thing, is that there are aggro decks in the format, there are other control decks in the format, and there are mid-range decks in the format. There's even a combo deck in the format. So there's a lot of different angles, a lot of different decks that this control deck has to look out for and safeguard against. And that may spread it a little bit too thin to completely adapt to this format. So there is that concern, but control decks, they're meant to adapt. And blue-black has an awful lot of options. So even though this deck hasn't innovated too much in this format right now, so far, it has the ability to, if need be. But in the end, I'm not sure that I see blue-black control rising up the ranks. But I do think it will have an important presence going forward here. Now, my number 5 deck, if I had done this video a week ago, it would have been in the top 3, but it's faltered just a little bit as the format moves on, but that doesn't mean it's not an important deck. It was 9% of the meta 5 days ago, but again, stumbled a little bit, but still an important deck, Mardu Vehicles. Now, like I said, everything old is new again. This deck plays 0 Ixalan block cards. If that's Ixalan and Rivals in the main deck. Occasionally you'll see some stuff in the sideboard, but for the most part, this is the same main deck Mardu Vehicles list that we've been seeing for a while. It again, though, just got a little bit better with the bannings. You know, Temur is not necessarily out of the format, but not the force it once was, and Temur was just a better deck. You know, in terms of a mid-range deck than Mardu ever was. Mardu, though, has the ability to be both a mid-range and an aggro deck. Its nut draws are still the best nut draws in the entire format. There's not a whole lot you can do to combat them, but it can also play a really nice laid-back mid-range strategy where it just outclasses you with big threats and good removal. So, and it's still doing that the same way it always did. You know, your low end is going to be Toolcraft Exemplar and Bomat Courier, and then on turn 2, you've got Heart of Kirin and Scrap Heap Scrounger. Now, all these cards, minus Bomat, maybe. The haste actually helps with this, but pretty much all of these cards can contribute to a really high damage output in the first few turns of the game. You know, if you get Toolcraft turn 1, Heart of Kirin on turn 2, and you swing in with the Toolcraft for 3 before your opponent's even played a second land. And then on turn 3, you go Scrounger, swing with Toolcraft and Heart of Kirin for 7. I mean, you're putting your opponent at 10, again, before they've even played their third land. Again, one more time, the nut draw for this deck is crazy, but if it doesn't get hit its, ridiculous 7 to start the game, again, it's got tools to hang back. On the higher end, we've got Hazaret. The deck also plays this ridiculous important threat from mono red, but we've also got Chandra at the higher end, which is just like the mono red decks and the Grixis decks. This is just one of the best cards in the entire format. If we've got red in our deck, we should probably play Chandra in the main. And just like the other decks that focus on red or black or both that we've looked at so far, we've just got the best removal in the format. Not only does this deck play Fatal Push and Abrade, and Vraska's Contempt in the sideboard usually, but we also have access to what has been called the best removal in the format. That's Unlicensed Disintegration. I'm not sure I jibe with that statement. It doesn't kill Rekindling Phoenix forever or Scarab God forever. It doesn't do anything about Hazaret or Ronus. There are some things that we got to worry about with Unlicensed. It doesn't kill Scrounger forever. But it does, just like I said with the red-black aggro deck, function as some late-game reach for us when we need it. And if we've just got to kill a huge thing like Torrential Gearhulk, this is a great way to do that and hit our opponent for 3 to the dome, maybe the last 3 that we need to finish the game off. These red decks, especially the red aggro list, lost Ramonap Ruins. I was just talking about that a second ago too. And so this is a great way to help make up for that loss. Now, as far as other cards the deck often plays, there's obviously Aethersphere Harvester. This is usually a 2 of in the main and at least a 1 of in the board, if not finishing off the playset. Just a ridiculous card in the aggro matchup, but it's gotten a little bit better actually with this new format, because not only is it as good as it ever was against, cards like Glorybringer, but it's now good against Rekindling Phoenix, which gives it a little bit more relevancy. There's also Veteran Motorist, Pianalar, and Walking Ballista. The deck doesn't play as many Ballistas as it once did. There was a time this deck played all 4 Ballistas, but you don't see that as often as you used to. Although, Ballista is fast becoming one of the most, feared cards in the format. There's a lot of, X1 creatures right now that people are utilizing, especially Glintsleeve Siphoner, Champion of Wits. So Ballista is becoming a very important creature at most points of the game, yet again, in this format, and it's overperforming for a lot of people that are trying it out. So I wouldn't be surprised if Ballista actually jumped up to 3 or 4 copies in most lists as we go through with the format here. And as far as Veteran Motorist and Pianalar, obviously Veteran Motorist is amazing. I just don't know why more people don't play this card. It's, Cruise Heart of Kiran gives you the scries. It's a decent deal even on turn 2 without a Heart of Kiran. It's just, Veteran Motorist is a very good card. It always has been. And Pianalar shows up yet again. Very, very important role player in this meta right now. Now, Mardu is an oldie, but it is still a goodie, too. It may be on the backslide just a little bit from what we can tell in the last week or so here. It's not posting as many results, but it's still top 8ing with relative frequency. So even though this deck looks like a dinosaur at this point, it's still a very good deck in this format that, again, is pretty fair against most of the meta. Now, disclaimer before we move on, there's already been one sort of separation of powers here. That's not really how that phrase is supposed to work, but still. I think there's some separation between 1 and 2, and then 3, 4, and 5. But I think there's another degree of separation between 6, 7, and 8. Now, I won't go all the way and say that those are different tiers, tier S, tier A, tier B, any of that. But I will say, again, that there is at least some degree of separation in the share of the meta that the next few decks have, as opposed to the few decks that we've covered so far. So let me just put that in perspective real quick. But my number 6 is God Pharaoh's Gift. Now, there are a few different variants of Gift right now, but the prevailing wisdom is to play the Esper Gift list that's on the refurbished God Pharaoh's Gift plan. Sometimes you'll see the Gate to the Afterlife list, but for the most part, it's almost all refurbished over the last week or so now. That's because there's an awful lot of graveyard hate, and this deck has changed its tune a little bit to, accommodate for all the hate in the format. If it needs to, it can just act like a pure mid-range deck. This deck has, for the most part, taken out Minister of Inquiries, which was what kind of blew my mind. But Minister of Inquiries, I guess a lot of people are assuming is too gimmicky at this point. You hinge a lot on it. It can die very easily before you get any value out of it, other than the energy that it brings you, which is good value, don't get me wrong. But Minister is just a little bit too dinky for God Pharaoh's Gifts nowadays. Again, they function more like straight-up mid-range decks that have a combo in them, They still play things like Chart a Course to dump cards into their graveyard. They still play Champion of Wits to dump cards into their graveyard. But they're a lot more of just a serious straight-up mid-range list that can grind out the game with God Pharaoh's Gift if forced to. Now, this list, these days at least, often plays more and at least different creatures. than it used to. You know, Angel of Invention, very important creature in this deck for a very long time, but the last couple of lists that have posted results actually don't play Angel of Invention at all. They seem to be more blue-black based with a white splash for a couple of cards. So it may surprise you that Angel has been cut, but it's mostly been cut, I think, in favor of Ravenous Chupacabra, which is showing up in this deck a lot more than Angel used to, mostly because it's good with Bugsy. You know, obviously the deck plays the Scarab God, but, you know, it's good with Bugsy and it's good to reanimate with Godfarer's Gift, and it's good the first time you play it out of your hand, too. Just Chupacabra really shines in this deck, where there are multiple ways to reanimate it, control the board with it, and even get a 4/4 body. No matter what you're reanimating it with. So there's that. There's also Kitesail Freebooter, which is one of the most important cards and one of the most important decks in Modern, and it translates pretty well to this deck too. It's great to reanimate, to keep removal and counter spells and stuff out of your opponent's hand. The deck also plays Sunscourge Champion at a 4 a lot of the time, because this card combats aggro really well, especially if you can reanimate it even once. And you don't even have to have a reanimation piece out to reanimate this card. It reanimates for pretty cheap by itself and fuels for future reanimation strategies. I'll go back to Chart a Course for just a second, because I really, really like this card in this deck. In the early game, it can be fuel for Godfarer's Gift. It can put Godfarer's Gift in the graveyard so you can refurbish it. There's a lot of cool stuff. You know, the deck needs a way to pitch cards while still drawing cards. So we essentially have a Tormenting Voice in the early game. But once we do have a good base of creatures set up and we can attack more comfortably, the card is crazy in that mode too. You know, 2 mana for 2 cards is an amazing deal. So Chart a Course is just really good in this deck. It's the deck for this card, because it gives it a discard outlet, a way to draw more cards, draw into gas, draw into its combo pieces, while still getting stuff in the graveyard. And when you turn the corner and go into attack mode, you can comfortably start attacking. It gives you a way to get more gas and stay in control in the late game. So Chart a Course is just ridiculous here. But all that said, the deck is still very susceptible to graveyard hate, obviously. And we've gotten even more new pieces out of Rivals that will help hose this deck. So not everyone has the guts to play it nowadays, but the deck does still produce results, especially in its new form, sort of Neo Gift. You know, it performs a lot more like a basic mid-range deck to get around all that graveyard hate, but you know, a lot of our deck is still devoted to a combo, so even one wrong move or one bad card on the other side of the battlefield, and we're in a little bit of trouble. But that being said, we still have a lot of amazing pieces, plus access to the Scarab God, so you cannot call this deck bad, and it's a dangerous deck, especially if its opponents don't come with enough sideboard pieces to help keep it in check. If anything, this deck is a good check on the format. Now, it was difficult to pick a 7th deck, to be honest. There's a lot of different decks that I want to showcase in this video, and we'll talk about that when we get to number 8, but I had to put a deck in number 7 that I liked a little bit better than the decks that I'll talk about for number 8. So with that in mind, what I think has a little bit of separation from the other crop of decks here is Red-Green Monsters, sometimes known as Red-Green Dinosaurs, but it only plays a couple of dinosaurs. This is essentially a just classic curve-out mid-range deck that plays the theoretically best creature at the curve at every single spot, all the way up until 5 or 6 drops sometimes. So I really like this deck. It's a classic way to play the game. Just play something they must answer every turn of the game. So let's take a look at this. This deck is just all about raw power, as you might imagine, as I was trying to get the point across a second ago. Early in the game, we've got Heart of Kiran and Merfolk Branchwalker. Note, by the way, that Branchwalker helps crew Heart of Kiran. If you can get the +1/+1 counter on it, that's obviously very, very relevant. But just like I talked about earlier, in these mid-range decks that must hit their drops, they're trying to play important cards, you know, all the way up till turn 5 or 6, it's really important that we get our lands, so Merfolk Branchwalker can help with that too. Same thing with Jadelight Ranger. This deck gets access to turn 3 Jadelight Ranger, and it can help us get those drops for our 4 and 5 drops. That we need as well. And it's just a scary creature on its own that needs to be answered. But while they're busy answering your Jade Lights and your Merfolk Branchwalkers and your Heart of Kirans in the early and mid game, you're moving on to bigger and better things. You got Glorybringer, you got all 4 copies of Rekindling Phoenix in this deck. It's just absolutely ridiculous what this thing can do when it comes to curving out. And if you hit the curve of Jadelight Ranger into Phoenix, into Glorybringer, your opponent's going to have a really hard time dealing with all of that. I mean, this deck isn't necessarily mindless, but there's not too much more to say about this deck. Obviously, we get some access to removal. We've got a Braid. We've got Lightning Strike occasionally, but usually you'll see a Braid. And you'll often see 2, 3, or sometimes even 4 copies of Magma Spray to make sure that decks don't get the jump on us. You know, if we're essentially trying to make it to where they have to answer us every single turn, this is a deck that's very focused on taking the initiative in the early and mid game. But if they get on board much faster than us and they play a bunch more creatures, we obviously can't take that initiative. We're worried about what they're playing. We're responding to them. It's not what we want to do. So Magma Spray is actually really good in this deck for making sure that not only can we take out early creatures, but we can squeeze drops. You know, on turn 4, we can go Jade Light and Magma Spray. That can sometimes be important. Turn 3, Heart of Kiran, you know, after Merfolk Branchwalker, for instance, Heart of Kiran and Magma Spray, sometimes a very important play. Double spelling with Magma Spray, important in the early game as well. But for the most part, we're just trying to curve out and make our opponent answer us and play our game. This deck takes initiative very, very well. The problem seems to be that the deck still has a little bit of clunk, though, and that's always the problem with these curve-out mid-range strategies, tap-out mid-range, whatever you want to call it, is that if they don't get exactly the right draw, then they're not going to do too great. These decks tend to aggressively mulligan to make sure they have good sequences all the way up until turn 4. So, you know, this deck isn't the most consistent list in the entire world, but I still really like decks of this style. Again, we're just going to play the best card for any given situation on every turn of the game. We're not going to care too much about what you're doing because you're going to be answering us. At least that's the game that we're trying to draw up here, and I always like decks like that. Now, you may have noticed that for number 8, I said we were going to talk about some decks, and that's because, plural, and that's because I don't think that there's one deck that I could, you know, put at number 8 and be happy about it. You know what I mean? I don't have the conscience to just put one deck at number 8. There's plenty of decks right now that have like 2.5% of the format, and I think they all deserve to be mentioned. Now, if there's a tribe from Ixalan that's doing a lot of work in Standard right now, it's Merfolk, I'd say, and Dinosaurs. As far as Dinosaurs, again, sometimes the green-red curve-out, you know, mid-range deck, the Monsters deck, is referred to as Dinosaurs because it'll play Death Gorge Scavenger occasionally, usually get a 2 of, actually. And then sometimes it'll play Regisar or Ripjaw, Carnage Tyrant very sparingly, sometimes in the sideboard. But it's not all in on Dinosaurs. That being said, there are some all-in Dinosaurs lists that have top 8'd or top 16'd already in this format. You know, there's a red-green list, there was a Jund Dinosaurs list that I saw top 16. And there's a Temur Dinosaurs list that I believe top 8'd, and the only blue that it's playing is Negate in the sideboard. And I think it's playing the Simic Nissa as well in the main deck. So that's a really interesting list, but Dinosaurs has posted some results. And I've seen some blue-green Merfolk decks with a lot of variation, also top 8'ing and top 16'ing too. So those are important decks in this meta right now. There's also a few different base blue-white lists. You know, you've got blue-white Cycling, blue-white Eternalize has actually had a strong and surprising showing at 2 different tournaments so far. And then the not quite blue-white Approach deck. We saw last format, blue-white Approach morphed into Jeskai Approach to fit Harness Lightning and a couple other red cards. But this format, it's morphing into a Bant Approach list, which I think is actually really interesting. And it's a weird one. It's essentially a ramp Approach of the Second Sun deck. It plays like Gift of Paradise, Now of Promise, which is odd to say the least, but the deck obviously posts results. It's top 8'd 2 different tournaments in just the last week, so that could be one to look out for moving forward here. I would take Bant Approach very, very seriously. And I'm pretty sure that's all the decks that I want to talk about today, at least. If I was going to sleeve something up, it would probably be one of the, you know, much more mid-range versions of Grixis right now. I like the control list, don't get me wrong, and I like the lists that are sort of half mid-range, half control, but I'd probably go all in on Grixis mid-range if I had to sleeve up 75 and go to an event, say, tomorrow. So that's my opinion on it, at least. And this is the result of a lot of data crunching, a lot of looking at tournament results over the last few weeks. So a lot of work went into this one. Make sure you like the video. And also, I'll say it one more time, if you're interested in any of these decks, just make sure you click any of the links in the description, and those will take you over to TCG Player. They help sponsor my content, and they've actually got something really, really cool now, where if you're selling cards, you can upload images of them, and if you're buying cards, you can obviously view images that sellers have uploaded. This is actually really, really cool, especially as a buyer. So if you're buying cards that are a little bit more obscure, or more expensive, or harder to find, you'll want to know what you're getting before you get it. And those are the cards that it's so far at least have had the most images uploaded of them. Are these sort of difficult to find cards, or these more expensive older cards. This can also be especially good for buyers that are looking for lightly played, moderately played, or even damaged cards, because you might look at an image of what the seller thinks is a moderately played card and you'll think, huh, looks lightly played to me, I'll pick that up right now for a good price. So this really also helps you get better deals overall. So check out TCG Player, not just for that, but also to look at any of the decks that I've talked about today. You can also follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev, or one more thing you can do, and I hope you stuck around for this, because I'm going to take an extra second here to talk about something that sucks that happened recently. But in any case, they actually just closed the restaurant that I've been working at for 7 years. And they didn't tell us they were going to close until the day before they closed. They closed the day before Super Bowl Sunday, which doesn't make any sense as a business person to me, but they shut it down. And we only had like 24 hours notice. So I guess that I'm full-time YouTube now, making that announcement. I guess I'll just start doing this all the time now, which means I should be able to release more content and I should be able to do way more work on the channel. But what I hope that you do is that you go to patreon.com/SBMTG and just put in $1. That's all you have to do. I'm not asking you to join the $5 or $10 reward tiers. There's stuff for you on those reward tiers. $5 patrons, your signed cards are going to go out in the next couple of days for this month. I'm getting everything ready for that. And $10 patrons, if you have a deck tech I haven't done yet, patron just processed. So if you have a new deck doctor that you want me to do, I'm getting to it as soon as possible. I've obviously got a lot more time on my hands now. So I'm getting to those as soon as possible. But if you want to join the $10 tier, you can. But I'm really just asking if you join the $1 tier, just $1 a month. I'll let you know what decks are coming out 24 hours before they come out. I'll give you exactly as much notice as they gave me when they closed the restaurant down. So, but if you help me out on Patreon, it would really mean an awful lot, not only to the channel, but to my future and being able to eat. I know I need to lose some weight, but I also want to be able to pay rent and stuff. So, just help me out if you can possibly do that. $1 a month is all I'm asking. But anyway, I guess if you want to look on the positive side, I'm a full-time YouTuber now officially. So that's the bright side, but help me out if you can. But anyway, I guess I'm done for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed the analysis of the format. Let me know how you felt about it down there in the comment sections. Get to talking to me because, this is a good video to have a dialogue about. Are there any decks that I missed that you think I should have covered since I covered all these other decks? There's probably something that you like that I didn't quite get to. So talk to me in the comments section and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.